It's midnight in Brussels when the US envoy slams his fist on the table demanding NATO impose sanctions on China. Across the globe, Beijing responds with a warning to Mexico: if you enforce those 50% tariffs, your economy will pay the price. Meanwhile, workers in Germany fear layoffs, Mexican car dealers shutter their showrooms, and in Iowa silos overflow with unsold soybeans as futures plummet in the biggest drop since 2012. In contrast, Brazil is thriving. New factories, fresh trade agreements, and growing ties with China are turning it into a major hub for China's economic expansion. And the big question is posed: has America managed to corner China, or is it pushing its own economy toward collapse? Inside the room, European leaders are confronted with the stark realities. The EU has a trade deficit with China of more than 300 billion euros. German car factories rely on Chinese battery cells, while French supermarkets are dependent on affordable Chinese goods. If tariffs are imposed, it's not Beijing that feels the hit first. It's Europe. The US makes its case bluntly. Without full alignment, NATO is essentially funding Russia's war. Countries still buying Russian oil, like Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey, are undermining sanctions. The solution, according to Washington, is to target China, the partner sustaining Moscow's energy lifeline. From Washington's perspective, it's a clear and logical move. But for Europeans, it feels like economic suicide. Factories in Wolfsburg warn of inevitable layoffs. An engineer confides that if Chinese batteries are banned, they won't be able to ship a single electric vehicle by the year's end. In Paris, retail chains are preparing for a 15% price hike if Chinese-made textiles and electronics are taken off shelves. The political fallout would be brutal. Governments have already fallen due to inflation. Could European leaders risk repeating that? Beijing's response is furious. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson accuses NATO of internationalizing coercion, while state-run media broadcast images of container ships rerouted to South America. In the first half of this year alone, Chinese buyers secured over 7 million tons of Brazilian soybeans, while US soybean orders dropped sharply. For decades, American farms fed China. Today, silos in Iowa are packed with unsold grain. The USDA estimates that US soybean exports to China once exceeded $34 billion annually, but Brazilian contracts are now taking over the market. Farmers who once relied on seasonal shipments watch as rail cars remain idle.
I'm staring at bins full of soybeans I can't move. Brazil already bought my crop.
Futures markets are shaken, with soybean prices dropping the most in a week since 2012. But this is more than just economics. It's leverage. Food was one of America's silent weapons, a resource China couldn't afford to ignore. By cutting US crops out of its market, Beijing is removing one of Washington's last remaining points of pressure. And as Brazil expands its port capacity in Peru and Argentina, the shift is permanent. Meanwhile, Mexico steps into the line of fire. Under pressure from Washington, it imposes 50% tariffs on Chinese cars, steel, and textiles. The impact is seismic. Mexico is China's largest car market in the Americas, selling over 280,000 vehicles in just 6 months. A dealer in Mexico City angrily shuts his showroom doors, lamenting that even at half price, his customers can't afford the vehicles. Beijing reacts swiftly, warning Mexico that retaliation could target exports of Mexican avocados and pork. For farmers in Michoacan, this could be disastrous. China buys what the domestic market can't absorb. Lose that market, and the entire region could collapse. Brazil, on the other hand, is seizing the opportunity. BYD celebrates the launch of its first electric vehicles from new plants in Sao Paulo. Soon after, Great Wall Motors announces a second factory for pickup trucks. Chery partners with Brazilian firms to expand its assembly lines. Each of these developments weakens Mexico's role as China's Latin American hub. The pattern becomes clear. When Washington builds walls, Beijing builds bridges. Rare earths flow from Africa under new long-term contracts. Grain from Brazil replaces Iowa soybeans. And electric vehicles are now manufactured in Brazil instead of Mexico. Global supply chains are reconfigured in a matter of months. But this wasn't supposed to happen yet. Tariffs were intended to isolate China, yet they're accelerating China's shift away from American dependence. Could the very strategy designed to corner Beijing actually be cornering Washington instead? That question jolts NATO leaders into action. In Berlin, policymakers quietly estimate that if Washington's plan is followed, inflation in the EU could rise by 8 to 15%. Italy warns of possible textile shortages. France fears widespread protests. German auto executives tell their government layoffs are inevitable. If NATO fractures over tariffs, Moscow will rejoice and Beijing will win. Meanwhile, Washington insists that the pressure must keep expanding. Officials point to India's rising imports of Russian crude, which now accounts for 40% of its oil, compared to just 1% before the war. If both China and India are financing Russia's energy sector, NATO sanctions are increasingly ineffective. The US argues that allies must choose between strategic unity and economic comfort. Markets are thrown into turmoil. Chicago pits record the largest single-day soy sell-off in a decade. European steel prices surge due to fears of supply cuts. Mexican automakers warn consumers to expect a 20% increase in vehicle prices, even after tariffs. Investors call it policy whiplash, draining confidence across global markets. In response, China takes action. Regulators investigate American tech giants for anti-competitive practices, and suddenly, US agricultural export licenses are suspended. Beijing hints that it could scale back its holdings of US treasuries if sanctions continue, rattling bond traders already concerned about high yields. In Brussels, divisions deepen. Southern European finance ministers balk at the tariffs, fearing their domestic economies cannot bear the impact. Germany hesitates to fully align with Washington, pointing to its deep dependence on Chinese supply chains. Behind closed doors, NATO unity is showing signs of strain. At the same time, Mexico's debate grows increasingly heated. Business leaders warn that aligning with Washington could cost billions in lost Chinese investment. Yet they're reluctant to give up US trade privileges under USMCA, considering them essential lifelines. The dilemma is stark: anger Beijing or risk Washington's wrath. Either path comes with heavy collateral damage. Brazil, meanwhile, is smiling. Every disrupted supply chain benefits its ports. Electric vehicles, soybeans, robotics. Analysts predict that Brazil could become China's gateway for advanced technologies across Latin America. From AI chips to next-generation batteries, Washington tries to isolate Beijing, but Brazil is reaping the rewards. In Europe, the fears go beyond inflation. Security agencies warn that alienating China could jeopardize access to critical raw materials. Rare earths, vital for both defense and green technologies, are still overwhelmingly supplied by China. Internal EU documents admit that replacing those resources could take years, during which NATO's technological advantage might be diminished. This scenario isn't theoretical, it's a matter of survival. The ripple effects reach Wall Street, where bond traders grow increasingly uneasy. Rumors circulate that China might scale back its purchase of US treasuries. Even a small reduction could raise borrowing costs to levels not seen in a generation. As the pressure builds, the final scene unfolds. Farmers in Iowa face unsold crops, German auto workers fear pink slips, and Mexican car dealers close their doors. Each crisis seems separate, but together they raise a single question. Is Washington's attempt to sanction China a strategy of strength, or is it setting off a realignment it cannot control? Mexico's tariffs hit $50 billion of trade. China's countermeasures erase America's price advantage on soybeans. Europe faces double-digit inflation if it aligns with Washington, and US farmers watch as contracts get canceled and crops rot. So the question remains: Washington demands NATO sanction China, Beijing warns Mexico, and Brazil reaps the benefits. But what if the alliance meant to isolate China has, in fact, isolated America?